Well, hello. This is the fourth part to a much longer reaction. If you haven't seen them yet, links to them are in the description as well in the top corner of the video. Now, with that out of the way, let's get this thing started then, shall we?
He does take his responsibilities seriously enough to do the bare minimum, as Undyne puts it, and he would have happily killed Frisk if he hadn't made a promise not to. As such, as far as ethics are concerned, Sans has a very particular attitude. He will happily kill children, but he would never break a promise, even if his brother is murdered. This combination of ethical ambiguity and extreme loyalty could easily work as motivation for him becoming the Roaring Knight if someone close to him asked him to do it. If he thought creating dark fountains would benefit Papyrus, I could definitely see him pursuing this path. In terms of opportunity, Sans has only recently arrived in town, so it's debatable if he could have created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain. Similarly, he has a day job working at his store, so it's unclear if he could have been in the right place at the right time to create the cyberworld. In Undertale, Sans could teleport, so if he still has that power in Deltarune, then it would be child's play to create these fountains, but we have no proof that Sans still possesses this ability. Overall, Sans is a very interesting character, and I wouldn't blame people for wanting him to play a larger role in the narrative, but I sincerely doubt he will. Sans has never liked the spotlight, so him becoming the Roaring Knight seems very out of character for him. Combine that with him failing to match any of the Knight's attributes, and it being unclear if he has ever had the opportunity to create the Dark Fountains, and I think it's safe to say that Sans probably isn't the Knight. He is a mysterious character, so I won't say it's outright impossible, but I don't think I can rank him any higher than D tier. He's definitely a less believable option than Papyrus. Next up is Sham. In terms of means, Sham has acquired many random items, including weapons, so it's entirely possible that they have a knife or a suit of armor. However, Sham has an unknown quantity of fingers, was a court magician and not a knight, and given how apathetic they are, I find it unlikely that they have any amount of determination. Then again, Sham was able to defeat Jevil, so maybe they are powerful enough to steal a Lightner's soul. In terms of motive, Sham has a distinctly nihilistic view of the world, and doesn't think anything really matters in the long run. They specifically state that they don't care if the Delta Warriors seal the fountain, because neither light nor dark holds a future for a Darkner in their condition, which seems to be proof that they don't care enough to bother becoming the Roaring Knight. Throw in the fact that Sham regularly helps out the heroes, and it seems distinctly unlikely that they have the right attitude to be the Roaring Knight. In terms of opportunity, Sham could have created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, but since we leave them in the castle town before heading to the cyberworld, it seems exceedingly unlikely that Sham could have beaten them there and created a Dark Fountain. Throw in the fact that Sham never seems to leave his shop, and it seems unlikely that Sham could have had the opportunity to create either Dark Fountain. Overall, Sham doesn't really match the Roaring Knight's attributes, doesn't seem to have the right motive to pursue this path, and doesn't seem to have had the chance to create the cyberworld. Throw in the assistance that they provide the heroes, and the fact that they talk about the Knight like they're a different person, and it just generally seems unlikely that Sham could be the Roaring Knight. Sham has enough power, knowledge, intelligence, and nihilism to potentially walk this path, so I don't think this option is completely impossible, but I do think Sham is a D tier candidate at best. Next up is Shyra, aka Lemon Bread. Shyra, as a fish, fails to meet even the most fundamental details necessary to match the Knight.
Yeah, that's kind of important.
She has no fingers, arms, armor, weapons, or any sort of association with Knights.
Again, kind of requires
she may
water.
or may not have possessed above average determination, although she is labeled as brave on her tombstone. In terms of motive, we know next to nothing about Shyra, so it's not really feasible to predict whether she could have reasons to bring about the roaring. In terms of opportunity, Shyra is dead, so that hurdle pretty much guarantees that she could not be in the right place at the right time to create these dark fountains. In short, Shyra is a dead fish who matches none of the knight's attributes, has no known motivation to bring about the roaring, and is currently dead, which largely makes...
Shyra is a dead fish who's currently dead. Yes, that kind of sums things up very succinctly.
This option impossible. Right to the bottom of F tier for her. I only bothered including her because they were one of the few named characters to become an amalgamate. Next up is the musical fish sister who is not dead, Shyren. Now, on her own, Shyren also doesn't have arms, knives, armor, or any of the things needed to be the knight. However, as we saw in Undertale, she sometimes disguises herself as a larger monster by floating above the body of her agent. As such, when combined together, Shyren and her agent could potentially have arms and fingers and weapons and so on. We never see them using such things, but it is at least possible. That said, she does seem to possess below average determination. In terms of motive, Shyren's sister is dead, and Shyren herself has always been somewhat ashamed of her singing voice. As such, maybe she wants to bring about the roaring in order to improve her own life, or something along those lines. It's not the strongest motive out there, but there might be something you could swing with her. In terms of opportunity, Shyren could theoretically have created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, but since she is resting in the hospital in Chapter 2, that may give her an alibi that proves she couldn't have created the library. Cyberworld. That said, there is one detail of note that could hint at Shyren holding a greater position of relevance than you might have expected.
Really?
I mentioned earlier that Onion-san heard a song from underneath the lake, and the same day we hear about this, Shyren can be found in the hospital recovering from overusing her singing voice. This seems to imply that Shyren was in the underground facility and that she was singing so loudly that Onion-san was able to hear her in the lake. This strained her throat so badly that she ended up in the hospital. Or so it seems. If that really is the case, then that could mean Shyren plays a larger role than we previously suspected, which actually makes sense. In Undertale, the river person talked about the song from the sea, which is the same song that Onion-san heard under the lake. And yet, in Undertale, nobody ever figured out what the song from the sea could be. This song will clearly play a larger role in Deltarune than it did in Undertale, but I refuse to believe that Toby Fox would hint at it in Undertale and not have some sort of answer in that game. This brings me to Shyren. In the fight with Shyren, which is an unavoidable encounter, you can keep singing with her, and it leads to this huge sequence in which a concert forms around you and which Sans himself shows up and starts selling tickets. Why would Toby Fox give this massive sequence to such a minor character? Well, maybe it's because she's not so minor after all. I wrote down the notes that she mentions in her battle, and I took the audio of her singing when she attacks you, and after repeatedly editing that audio and recreating her song with different instruments, what I found is that the song she is singing has no resemblance to any other song in the game. I think this song, Shyren's song, is the song from the sea, and that she holds some important position in the plot. I don't think that proves she's the knight, but I do think it proves she is something. Overall, Shyren really isn't that much better of a match for the knight than her sister was. The only advantage Shyren has is that she's alive and might have some connection with the underground facility. But even that doesn't make up for her distinct lack of means, motive, and opportunity to be the Roaring Knight. As such, she goes right down into F tier with her sister. She's literally a fish, after all. And while I think a fish can be important, I don't think a fish can be a knight. Unless that fish is humanoid, but we'll get to the humanoid fish later. Next up is the final bird Undyne, in this video, Snowy. In terms of means, much like the other snowdrakes, Snowy doesn't have fingers, arms, or any noticeable connection to knives or armor or knights, and it's unknown if he possesses any notable amount of determination. In terms of motive, Snowy had a very unhappy home life in Undertale, and that was only resolved by the intervention of Frisk and the return of Crystal in the form of an amalgamate. In the Deltarune timeline, that can't happen, so it stands to reason that he may still have an unhappy home life that is pushing him towards more extreme paths, such as becoming the Roaring Knight. He is also one of Chris's classmates, so it would make sense if he held some greater relevance in the plot. In terms of opportunity, Snowy attends the school and thus could have created the Card Kingdom, and although we never see him at the library, we also receive no evidence proving that he couldn't have been at the library at the time that the cyber world was created. As such, he could very well have had the chance to do what the knight has done. However, overall, Snowy is a comical side character who doesn't match the knight's physical description at all. In the slightest, and that hurdle is unfortunately a bit too much to overcome. The knight has hands. Snowy does not. So he goes down into F tier with the other snowdrakes. Side note, I won't be ranking Snowy's dad, as he was an extremely minor character in Undertale, and an even more minor character in Deltarune, and there's nothing more to be said about him than what has already been said about Shielddrake, Crystal, and Snowy.
Honestly, I wish that Jaru had done that with more characters, because so many of these characters are just such wasted time talking about them because there's like literally no possibility of them being the knight.
Next up is the man, the myth, the big shot, Spamton.
Again,
in terms
Darkner.
of means, Spamton has even shorter arms than Chris, has an unclear quantity of fingers, does not wear armor or use weapons, and is not
until you know the
neophyte, but on the upside, though, he owns a store where he sells weapons and armor, which could include knives, and he does seem to be rather determined.
Well, that's the thing. Like, weapons and armor is in heavy quotation marks there, because as soon as you take them out of the store, it turns out that they're literal junk.
He is literally the character who introduces the idea of stealing the souls of Lightners. Although, since he failed to steal Chris's soul, it does seem unlikely that he has successfully stolen anyone else's soul.
Yeah.
In terms of motive, Spamton makes his intentions perfectly clear. He wants to steal the soul of a Lightner in order to do something involving heaven. And who else is known to be involved with heaven?
The angel!
Knight, who is going to bring about the angel's heaven. The pieces line up shockingly well in that regard. In terms of opportunity, Spamton has more grounds to be the knight than you'd expect. Sham knows who Spamton is, which implies that Spamton has visited the Card Kingdom before. As such, Spamton could have potentially had the opportunity to create their Dark Fountain. He also lives in the cyberworld, so maybe he could have created their fountain as well. The only issue with this idea is that if Sham and the Queen both already know who Spamton is, then why wouldn't they recognize him as being the knight? Furthermore, if Spamton had already stolen the soul of a Lightner before, then why does he have so much trouble stealing Chris's? Things don't quite seem to line up. And of course, like all the other secret bosses, Spamton is defeated and becomes a part of our inventory, while the knight is an ongoing threat, so that seems to hurt this option substantially. Overall, Spamton has the perfect motive, but he doesn't really have the right attributes, and his connections with Sham and Queen damage the validity of him secretly being the Roaring Knight. Throw in the fact that he has been vanquished and pacified by the end of Chapter 2, and this whole option falls apart. As such, while not as inconceivable as Jevil, I do think that Spamton is a D-tier candidate at best.
D-tier, really?
Next up is Starwalker. These birds are pissing him off. He's the original Starwalker. Next up is Susie. In terms of means, Susie wears armor, is referred to as a Dark Knight in the menu, appears to have 4 fingers, and definitely seems to have a fair amount of determination. That said, she doesn't actually use a knife at any point, and she actively refuses to use any of Chris's swords. In terms of motive, it seems to be implied that Susie has an unhappy home life, as she never actually seems to want to go home. She's always hungry, which seems to imply that her family doesn't feed her, and when Toriel tells her to call her family and let them know that she's staying over, she fakes it for a second, but then doesn't do it.
Yeah, I mean, in another world, I could definitely see Susie being the knight. Like, but again, there's the whole thing that, like, she's, like, pretending really well about not knowing about Dark Worlds at all. Then there's also the whole thing about, you know, the king not recognizing her at all. And there's the whole thing about her being surprised when Rousey talks about the roaring in Chapter 2.
Given her connection with Lancer and the fact that she has so much in common with the Spade King, and I'm inclined to think that she also has an abusive father in her life who caused her to be the way she is. With this backstory, it makes perfect sense that she'd want to create more dark fountains. She even tells Chris that she wants to bring the Darkeners to the Light World, despite everything that Rousey said about the roaring. As such, Susie has a well-established motive for being the knight. In terms of opportunity, this is where Susie being the knight starts to fall apart. For one, Susie is one of the most blunt and straightforward characters in the game. So the idea of her concealing anything, much less the fact that she's the Roaring Knight, is completely unbelievable.
Yeah, the saying that comes to mind is that Susie is as subtle as a brick wall. It's not like... I actually, thinking about it, I'm pretty sure she's physically incapable of like, having a secret or hiding anything.
Throw in the fact that she's with us for the entire time when the knight is supposed to be creating the cyber world, and Susie pretty handedly gets eliminated as an option. Overall, Susie is actually one of the better fits to be the knight, as she has almost all of the knight's attributes on top of having a very clear motivation for pursuing this path. However, the evidence seems to prove that Susie could not have been in the right place at the right time to do what the knight is known to have been doing. As such, while Susie being the knight is far from impossible, the idea has too many major flaws to be particularly compelling, which lands Susie in D tier.
Yeah.
Next up is Swatch. In terms of means, we never see Swatch's hands. They don't wear armor or use weapons. They are a butler and not a knight. And while they do have a past working with Lightners, there is no implication that Swatch has ever tried or succeeded in stealing a Lightner's soul, which means they almost certainly don't have access to determination. In terms of motive, Swatch is a loyal servant of the Queen who actively manages her estate and keeps ne'er-do-wells like Spamton and Rule's Card from causing trouble. While there may be some thin layer of exasperation in Swatch's service, they never demonstrate any sort of disloyalty to the Queen, and when the Delta Warriors bring Swatch to the castle town, Swatch shows loyalty to them as well. Given that the Roaring Knight is opposed to the Delta Warriors, you'd think Swatch would make a greater effort to oppose or at least not help the heroes if Swatch really was the Roaring Knight. In terms of opportunity, Swatch has never been known to visit the Card Kingdom, and even if they created the cyberworld, Swatch knows the Queen, and thus the Queen would likely recognize that Swatch was the Roaring Knight.
Yeah, that's
As
kind of
such,
important
it
right
seems
there.
distinctly unlikely that they had the opportunity to do what the Knight has done. Overall, Swatch fails to match the Knight's attributes, generally doesn't seem to have any motive for bringing about the Roaring, and also doesn't seem to have had the chance to create the Dark Fountains. Admittedly, Swatch is a very minor character with much less relevance to the plot than someone like Sham, so much of their character is too shrouded in mystery to really make a confident declaration on their viability for being the Knight. As such, since so much about them is unknown, I'll put Swatch in D tier instead of F tier.
Oh, come
Next
on.
up is Swatch's female counterpart, Task Manager. In terms of means, Task
Manager as the female counterpart of Swatch? Yeah, I don't see it. I mean, like, Task Manager is all about order. Swatch was more about creativity, given that, you know, there's the idea that they're from, like, a paint program or something like that. Yeah, I don't see it.
Task has 4 fingers, but she doesn't actually have arms, which contradicts with the Knight, who is clearly depicted with arms. That said, she seems metallic enough to be considered wearing armor, and she seems very determined to maintain order in the mansion, although she doesn't use a knife. In terms of motive, Task Manager is exclusively devoted to maintaining order, and since the Roaring is said to bring chaos and devastation, it seems exceedingly unlikely that she would pursue such an endeavor. In terms of opportunity, Task Manager lives in the cyberworld and thus could have created their Dark Fountain, and she clearly recognizes Jevil, which implies that she has visited the Card Kingdom before and thus could have created their Dark Fountain as well. However, since the Queen seemingly met the Knight and Task Manager is literally the Queen's maid, it seems exceedingly unlikely that the Queen would fail to realize that Task Manager is the Roaring Knight.
Yeah.
Overall, Task Manager meets a handful of the Knight's attributes and may have had the opportunity to create Dark Fountains, but her devotion to order and opposition to chaos directly contradicts with the path of the Roaring Knight, and pretty strongly implies that she is not them. While she has more connections than most, she has enough problems to only deserve D tier. Next up is Tami. In terms of means, Tami did sell some sort of super armor in Undertale, and she definitely has very long legs, but she has paws instead of hands.
You know, I don't know why, but thinking back to the first time I played Deltarune, I could have sworn Tami, like, put the egg up on the desk with her tail. I never considered that being one of her legs or arms or whatever she has.
Does not have fingers, does not wear armor or use knives, and has an unclear quantity of determination, although she is studying extra hard. In terms of motive, Tami just seems to want to go to college, and given how generally straightforward and simple the Tamis are, I'm inclined to believe this motivation, which means she doesn't really have any reason to pursue the Roaring. In terms of opportunity, Tami attends the school and has been seen at the library, so she seems to have had the chance to create these Dark Fountains if she so desired. Overall, Tami is a silly joke character who doesn't match the Knight's attributes and doesn't seem to have any reason to pursue the Roaring.
Oh god, again, another one of those weird thoughts. Can you imagine that when the Knight's, like, revealed, it is actually Tami, but it's sort of like in a similar case to, like, with Greater Dog, where they're, like, really little and just the suit of armor is just very big and somehow is able to move around with them, like, just basically being the head. Like, that would be so weird.
As such, given her flaws and overall insignificance, I'm inclined to put her in F tier, but I'll settle for D tier.
Why?
Next up is Toriel. In terms of means, she doesn't wear armor or use weapons, she has never been a knight, she doesn't use a knife on screen at any point, and we never actually see how many fingers she possesses. That said, it's probable that she has 5 fingers, just like Asgore and Asriel, and given that she's a boss monster, she probably has above average determination by default. In terms of motive, Toriel is a distinctly conservative and religious woman, as she had both her children regularly attending church, and she has the Deltarune plastered all over her house. She literally wears that symbol on her robe in Undertale. As such, it could be that she wants to bring about the angels' heaven for religious reasons. However, this all largely goes against her overall characterization. Toriel was the first character to teach us the importance of non-violence in Undertale, and she desperately did everything in her power to protect the lives of children. As such, the idea of her creating dangerous dark fountains in the school and library where her children and students attend seems obscenely out of character for her. Toriel has never believed in committing evil for the sake of the greater good, and she seems to have a fairly happy home life, so the idea of her being the Roaring Knight does not seem to line up with her character. In terms of opportunity, Toriel works at the school and is noticeably absent during the time when the knight is creating the cyberworld. However, given that Chris's cell phone doesn't work in the Dark World, it seems likely that Toriel's phone wouldn't work either. As such, the fact that you can call Toriel at any point during your walk to the library seems to confirm that she is not in the Dark World.
I'm almost 3 hours into this video. I am over 3 hours into recording this video because I accidentally had to stop recording for a bit. And after all this time, the thought that the knight might be a character that we haven't actually met yet had not yet come across my mind, when like so many of these characters, that especially the ones that Jaru's gone over, have like little to no, like with the exception of like a few, have little to no like reasonable ability to be the knight, unless like the plot was heavily like contrived in a way to just say, hey, they were the knight. The more I watch this, the more I think that they're going to be a character that we haven't actually met yet,
and thus cannot be the one creating the cyberworld. Furthermore, if Toriel had created this dangerous dark fountain in the library only for her child to call her and tell her that they are heading towards that library, wouldn't she try to discourage them from going there? The fact that she doesn't seems to imply that she didn't create that dark world. Overall, Toriel is a pretty terrible match for the Roaring Knight. Outside of her fingers and above-average determination, Toriel does not possess most of the knight's attributes. Her morality and non-violence seem to oppose the idea of bringing about the roaring, and the fact that you can call her seems to prove that she couldn't have been the one creating the cyberworld. As such, I am sorely tempted to put her in F tier. However, considering how Deltarune seems to parallel Undertale in many ways, and since Asgore was the main antagonist of that game, it would definitely be up Toby Fox's alley to flip the script and have Toriel be the main antagonist instead. She was the first boss you fought in Undertale, so why not have her be the last boss you fight in Deltarune? Since that idea seems interesting enough to be conceivable, I'll go ahead and put her in D tier instead of F tier. Next up is the current chief of police, Undyne. In terms of means, Undyne seems to have 4 fingers. She was the leader of the Royal Guard in Undertale and thus wore armor, used weapons, and was tied to knighthood, and she was rather famous for being the most determined of all monsters, to the point that she could resurrect herself from death. And while she never used a knife in combat, she did own a giant sword, and it's implied that she was a fan of using all sorts of weapons. In terms of motive, Undyne was willing to kill children in Undertale, so it's not impossible to imagine her being persuaded to become the Roaring Knight if she thought she had to in order to save her people. However, she is also a fairly ethical person, and she takes her job of protecting her people extremely seriously. She's literally the chief of police, which means it's her job to protect this town. As such, the idea of her creating dark fountains in the school and library and endangering the very children she is supposed to protect seems very out of character for her. In terms of opportunity, it's entirely possible that Undyne created the Card Kingdom, but the cyber world is another matter entirely. It's true that she's hanging out just outside the library, which would definitely seem to put her at the scene of the crime. But she says herself that she had been directing traffic when this traffic jam occurred. This is corroborated by several other characters, including the appearance of the annoying dog. As such, if Undyne has been busy directing traffic this entire time, then it's not really possible for her to have been creating the Dark Fountain in the library. In fact, her being the chief of police means she pretty much always has eyes on her, which means it's hard for her to ever sneak off and create dark fountains. That said, there is the matter of her being called by Toriel at the end of Chapter 2. Notably, Undyne never seems to arrive, so this could be hinting that she was off doing Roaring Knight stuff when Toriel called. But then again, Toriel never uses Undyne's name, so it's possible that she was speaking to Napstablook. Alternatively, there is a small time skip where it transitions to Toriel being asleep. I highly doubt that Toriel would just go to sleep without first talking with the police, which inclines me to think that we simply don't get to see the scene where Toriel and Undyne talked.
I never thought of that before. That's right. Again, like the idea that she just fell asleep after, calling the cops, and, having already turned off the lights. That almost showed... I'd never even thought of that before. Oh my god!
If I were to guess, Undyne probably investigated, found nothing, talked to Toriel, and then promised to watch over the house for the night. I wouldn't be surprised if Undyne was sitting outside, possibly having fallen asleep. As such, there really is no clear instance of Undyne sneaking off to do Roaring Knight things. Overall, Undyne is a certified knight in at least one timeline, and thus she could hypothetically match the attributes of the Roaring Knight. However, her personality and morality makes it exceedingly doubtful that she would pursue this path, and especially not in the way that the knight has behaved thus far. Throw in her lack of clear opportunity to create these dark fountains, and her chances to be the Roaring Knight seem pretty mediocre. That said, she's not a terrible candidate, she just has problems, so I'll put her in C tier. Next up is the vessel from the intro sequence. I wasn't originally going to talk about this one, but you guys brought it up in my community post on the topic, and you convinced me to give it some analysis. In terms of means, the vessel seems humanoid, so it likely has 5 fingers, and if Gaster is giving it a human soul, then that would imply it has determination. Unfortunately, that's about all the similarities with the knight that we can confirm. It seems to be about Chris's size, and Chris had notably short arms, and since this vessel is given no backstory, we have no way of knowing if it is associated with knights or knives or anything of the sort. In terms of motive, this entity is literally programmed by us during the intro sequence, so it's entirely feasible that it has no internal motivations on its own. Then again, if this is some sort of Pinocchio scenario, then maybe the vessel wants to bring about the roaring for a similar reason to Spamton. Maybe the vessel hates being a puppet whose choices don't matter, so it's trying to summon the angels' heaven in order to earn its own free will. Although, again, we really don't know.
Yeah,
in terms
it's
of
quite literally a blank
this
slate.
option has all the same problems as Frisk and Kara, as you'd expect a new human coming to town to catch some people's attention. This may be doubly true for the vessel, because if it looks like a goner, then it would stand out like a sore thumb. That said, the Goners in Undertale could seemingly blink in and out of reality. So if the vessel can do that as well, then maybe it could just teleport into the library and the school in order to create these dark fountains. Hard to say. Overall, the vessel is an interesting option, and I can see why you guys would suggest it. We still don't know what the point of that intro sequence is, so having the vessel be the knight would finally fit it into the greater narrative of Deltarune. However, sadly, we know so little about the vessel that it's extremely difficult to judge what role or attributes it possesses.
Honestly, I'm still holding out hope that we'll have, like, some sort of like meeting with Chris using the vessel, because like again, you make it, and I really hope that it wasn't just a one-off thing that was just thrown away. I love the idea that like we get separated from Chris and we have to like take control of the vessel and maybe even have the ability to actually talk to Chris themselves. Like, to maybe just hopefully to like iron things, to smooth things over with them just a little bit.
It could be a perfect fit for the knight, or it may have nothing to do with the knight at all. Furthermore, at the end of the intro sequence, they literally say that the vessel is discarded. So that could imply that this vessel that we create no longer exists. That said, since the vessel is such a mysterious entity, and since it could, hypothetically, fulfill many of the requirements necessary to be the knight, I'll go ahead and put it in B tier. I think it is about as likely to be the knight as Chris is, which is to say, I don't personally think the vessel is the knight, but it has a much better chance than most of the other characters. And last, but certainly not least, W.D. Gaster. In terms of means, the knight is heavily associated with hands, and Gaster is specifically known as the man who speaks in hands. He's also probably the person who invented the determination extraction machine, which means that if anyone could have artificially enhanced their own determination, it would be Gaster, which means he has a solid chance of being able to create dark fountains. However, that's about all the known similarities we can pinpoint.
Again, you can't really use the sprite to describe how he looks like, because we're not even sure if that's, what he actually looks like. And we know almost nothing about his personality. Well, not almost, literally nothing about his personality, besides the fact that he was supposedly a smart scientist.
Gaster is extremely mysterious, so we have no idea if he was associated with knives, armor, knighthood, or even how many fingers he actually has. In terms of motive, this is where
that's the twist. He has 6.
Things get extremely speculative. Nobody really knows what kind of person Gaster was, or what reasons he might have for doing the things he does. Maybe he wants to bring about the roaring out of scientific curiosity. Maybe he wants to bring about the roaring in order to resurrect someone he cares about. Maybe he's a mad scientist who just wants to watch the world burn. Or maybe Gaster is a harmless old man who doesn't want to hurt anybody. We really have no idea. His depiction in the intro sequence with the Goner Maker could be foreshadowing of him being the knight, but it could just as easily be foreshadowing of a completely different plot twist. I will point out, in Undertale, Gaster created the core, which includes these pillars that are labeled darkness totems in the game files. Similarly, if you look at the pattern on the floor, it looks eerily similar to the double door entryways that lead into the dark worlds that we see in Deltarune.
Okay.
Combining that with Gaster famously talking about something being darker yet darker, and it could easily be argued that Gaster has some connection with the realm of darkness, which could work as evidence that he is the Roaring Knight, whose goal is to cover the world in darkness. In terms of opportunity, this is where I believe the evidence turns against Gaster being the Roaring Knight.
Yeah, of course it does.
It is generally believed that the person who messed up Jevil and Spamton was Gaster, and this is something that Sham talks about. Sham specifically says that Jevil met a strange someone. However, and this is important, when talking about the Roaring Knight, Sham highlights their name in red. And yet, Sham does not do this for the strange someone that Jevil met. This seems to imply that Sham does not consider the Knight and Gaster to be the same person. Although Sham does refer to both characters as strange, so that could be hinting that they're connected in some way. However, there's also the matter of the strange man who gives you eggs. We don't know if this man is Gaster. However, if he is Gaster, then that means this happy man in a car is also Gaster, which could be evidence that he is not the Roaring Knight, as he was stuck outside in this traffic jam during the time that the cyberworld was being created.
You know, just the thought that Gaster was stuck in traffic, that is really funny. Honestly, that is really funny.
Although you could argue that he created the cyberworld and then ran out to his car, so it's not concrete evidence. Outside of that, though, we really don't know when or how or if Gaster could have created these dark fountains. It's not impossible. He totally could have made them. We just know so little about him that it's difficult to judge.
Yeah.
Overall, Gaster is so shrouded in mystery that it's extremely difficult to judge his candidacy for being the Knight. He is known as the man who speaks in hands, which could be faintly hinting that he's the Knight. But his name is not highlighted in red by Sham, which could be faintly hinting that he's not the Knight. His Undertale counterpart clearly worked on darkness-based projects, which could be evidence that he's the Knight, but he may just have been studying it to see how it works, and thus this might say nothing about him being the Knight. As such, overall, the evidence we currently have really just doesn't paint a clear picture one way or another. I personally do not believe Gaster is the Knight, as I've always gotten the impression that Gaster was a man who works from the shadows and doesn't really want to be in the center of attention. From a meta standpoint, I've always gotten the impression that Gaster is a character that Toby Fox wants to keep out of sight and mysterious. And if Deltarune parallels Undertale, I would not be surprised if Gaster just never directly appears in the plot at all.
And you know for a fact, if that does happen and Gaster is never directly referred to, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be very angry.
However, given that Gaster clearly plays an important role in this story, he is clearly tied to darkness, and his theme song is plastered all over Deltarune, and I cannot deny that Gaster is an incredibly strong contender. As such, I'll be putting him in A tier. And that is the full and complete ranking of all the possible candidates for being the Knight. Overall, while any of these characters
So Jaru's
could
theory.
end up being
Let's
the
see
knight,
what this is gonna
I
be.
think Kara, Father Alvin, Mad Dummy, and Gaster have a substantially higher chance than any of the others. Of course, as many of you have likely already considered, it's also entirely possible that the knight is a brand new character who we haven't met yet. And you're right. I think that is absolutely a valid possibility.
I mean, honestly, it does make sense. I mean, while, you know, it is good storytelling. Oh yeah, have like seeds and like hints, or like even like somebody pointing towards, you know, somebody you know being like the antagonist of the story. I mean, in a lot of stories, the antagonist isn't actually revealed until partway through. And like, again, we're only part 2 of 7. And again, we're only chapter 2 of 7 potentially. So like, we're not even like, we're barely like a quarter of the way through. So anything's possible.
In fact, I even have a specific idea regarding who and what that brand new character might be.
Oh God, here we go. Oh no.
My theory. This theory of mine, like most of my theories, involves a fair amount of speculation. It also builds upon my previous theories, which means if those theories turn out to be wrong, then that would hurt this theory's chances as well.
Yeah,
However,
of course.
I still sincerely believe this theory has a high chance of being correct. So, who exactly do I believe is the Roaring Knight? Well, as I said, I think the Roaring Knight is a brand new character. However, this brand new character is deeply tied to many of the existing Deltarune and Undertale characters. In fact, I think the existence of this character as the Roaring Knight is an integral part of foreshadowing my Rousey theory. You see, I had a particular theory regarding exactly what Rousey was, and I still feel quite confident in my conclusion. However, many people found my logic to be too big of a leap. They needed more evidence, and the more I thought about it, if my Rousey theory was correct, then Toby Fox would need to foreshadow it much more directly in order for the audience to not feel completely bamboozled. If my Rousey theory is correct, then it will be one of the final big mysteries unveiled to the audience, which means we will need something major to push us in that direction ahead of time.
And what is it?
Major foreshadowing, I think, will be delivered by the Roaring Knight. Here's exactly how I think this is going to play out. When we finally confront the Roaring Knight, he will be this huge, bulky man wearing armor that looks suspiciously similar to Undyne. At some point during this confrontation, the knight will remove his helmet, and the face we see will be one that we instantly recognize. It won't be Undyne's face. It won't be Mad Dummy, Father Alvin, Gaster, or Kara either. It will be the face of Gerson. However, when he starts to speak and we see his character portrait appear, it won't be completely black and white like the Lightners. Instead, his face will have faint bits of color as well as a few new distinct facial details that make him look different from the Gerson that we know. In fact, he will look like a younger version of the old turtle. How could this be? Well, let's break it down. Many people have theorized that Father Alvin is the Roaring Knight, as he has heavy ties to Deltarune and the Angel. However, while I think we are right to turn our attention towards Father Alvin, I think Toby Fox has very cleverly disguised the truth. I think Father Alvin is a red herring. But not just any red herring. I think Father Alvin is important for understanding who and what the Roaring Knight is.
Oh, wait a second. I think so. They are going on the whole thing of like what happens. So Jaru's theory literally is the whole thing about like, oh, what happens if you have a darkener made out of the remains of a lightener, and the knight, presumably because they're made of the remains of a lightener, even if it's just the dust of a monster, would potentially be able to exist in the light world, maybe even just temporarily. And maybe Father Alvin was responsible for putting his father's remains in a dark world and having a darkener created from it.
But I don't think he is the knight himself. If he was, I'm convinced he would have been given his own dialogue portrait and his own unique voice. Father Alvin is not the Roaring Knight, but he is responsible for the creation of the Roaring Knight. You see, as I discussed in my Rouse video, I believe that when an object coated in the dust of a monster is exposed to a dark fountain, a very special kind of entity is created. This entity possesses the powers of both a darkener and a lightener, and is thus incredibly powerful. So, what does this have to do with Gerson? Well, simple. Gerson died and thus turned to dust. Father Alvin, his son, then took Gerson's dust and spread it across Gerson's hammer. This hammer was imbued with the essence of Gerson Boom. However, through some unknown circumstances, this hammer found itself exposed to the power of a dark fountain. Maybe when Father Alvin buried Gerson's hammer, this hammer accidentally fell down into the facility that runs beneath the town. Maybe there is a dark fountain down there that brought this hammer to life. That would explain why Jevel associated the night with hell and with the underground. Or maybe Father Alvin is in on this plan and intentionally created a dark fountain in the underground facility in order to bring his father back to life. However, no matter what the exact circumstances were, instead of resurrecting Gerson Boom, what we instead got was the Roaring Knight. An entity with the appearance and mannerisms and memories of Gerson, but with a fundamentally different identity. This entity pondered its own existence and pondered the memories of Gerson Boom, which it had inherited, in order to try and figure out the purpose for its creation. As it recalled the story of the angel, and all the research Gerson had done into the Deltarune, the knight came to a conclusion. He needed to bring about the roaring and achieve the angel's heaven. Why does the knight want to do this? There are many possibilities. Maybe it hates its own existence and wants to destroy the world. Maybe it is confused by its existence and wants to confront the angel in order to discover his purpose. Or maybe he has some other goal that's more noble and altruistic. Whatever the case, the knight would have access to the memories of Gerson, and thus would know of several places that would make for perfect spots to create dark fountains. For starters, Gerson was a teacher, and thus the knight had memories of this empty classroom, and chose it as the location of his first dark fountain. He then needed to put someone in charge of this new dark world to defend his dark fountain while he went off and created more. You see, as a scholar, Gerson likely stumbled across the legend of the Delta Warriors, and thus the knight knows about them as well. As such, he is likely aware that these warriors will come to seal his fountain. In order to prevent this, he looks for a Darkner willing to do his bidding. He finds the Spade King, a powerful Darkner so filled with hatred that he'd be willing to kill the Lightners on the Knight's behalf. Seeing this opportunity, the Knight overthrows the other kings and shares the legend of the Deltarune with the Spade King and assures him that this plan will create a world covered in darkness where Darkners can rule. It is because the Knight shared this legend with the king that the king knows about the Delta warriors at all. This is also why Lancer knows about this legend. During this scene, if you refuse to listen to Rousey's story, Lancer mentions that he is the teardrop-shaped Darkner from the legend. And yet, how could Lancer have known this image was featured in the story? Rousey wasn't literally showing pictures to Chris and Susie.
I mean, are you so sure about that? Knowing Rousey, he might have actually been.
So how did he know about this? He knew about it because the Knight likely revealed this legend to the king and Lancer beforehand, and he either showed them pictures of the legend from one of Gerson's books, or he just assured them that a character like Lancer appeared in it. Furthermore, the king was more than happy to devote his loyalty to the Knight because the Knight wasn't actually a Lightner. The Knight was, as far as the king was concerned, a super powerful Darkner that was going to bring about a utopia for his people. Of course he'd devote his loyalty to that. That's why the Spade King wields the Chain of Justice. The Knight is literally the hammer of justice brought to life. That's also why the Knight will wear armor that looks suspiciously similar to Undyne's armor. Undyne was heavily inspired by Gerson in the Undertale timeline, and thus she likely modeled her armor after Gerson's armor. That's why she wields the Spear of Justice, and now that the Spade King is also being inspired by the Knight, it's why he wields the Chain of Justice. The Knight would go on to create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain, and during that time, he encountered Queen.
Well, actually, thinking about it, if, the whole, granted, this is very much getting into crack theory territory without further proof, but, you'd think that some people in town may recognize, oh, hey, who's that? And why do they look like, a younger version of, the old fantasy writer that used to live in town?
And called himself the Roaring Knight. The reason the Knight chose this place was because, just like with the unused classroom, the Knight had memories of the library. Gerson was a scholar and a writer after all, so it makes perfect sense that he would have visited this library frequently. However, unlike with the Card Kingdom, the Knight didn't stick around to put someone in charge to defend his fountain. Why could that be? Well, I think the reason was because the Knight accidentally created this dark fountain while Noelle and Birdley were in the computer lab. I think the Knight felt threatened by the sudden presence of Lightners in his dark world, so he fled the scene before he could set up a new regime to defend his dark fountain. However, now that he has created a dark fountain in the library and the unused classroom, where was the Knight going to create the next fountain? Well, Gerson's son is the priest at the church, so that would be a logical next location. However, everyone's going to church in the next chapter, so I think that may end up forcing the Knight to go somewhere else. Figuring that the school had worked out before, I believe the knight's next dark fountain will be created in the other unused classroom. In fact, I think Spamton directly foreshadows this.
Really?
Spamton mentions that they don't need easels or CRTs. CRTs is likely referring to
TVs.
CRT televisions, while the easels are a reference to the stands that artists paint on. I think these easels that Spamton is referencing are located in this classroom. I think this room is the art room for the school. As such, I think Chapter 3 will be us going through the dark world that Chris created in front of their CRT television, while Chapter 4 will be us going to this unused classroom and dealing with the dark fountain that the knight created. In order to wrap this particular theory up, let's take a look at the means, motive, and opportunity of this hypothetical character that I've dreamt up and see if he makes sense within the context of the evidence we have regarding the knight. We don't know what name the Roaring Knight calls itself, so I'll just call my theoretical character the Hammer, since I think he is a Darkner created from Gerson's hammer.
You know, that just makes me think of that, forget what the general's name was, but from that cartoon, Symbiotic Titan, there was the one giant robot that the U.S. military made called the Hammer, and the general who was in charge of the program is just so, like, happy that people are talking about it. It's like he's just flipping from news channel to news channel, listening like, the Hammer, click, the Hammer, click, the Hammer. It's so funny.
In terms of means, the hammer should be physically extremely similar to Gerson, just like how Rousey is physically very similar to Azrael. As such, the hammer should have 4 fingers, decently long arms, and him having a shell could easily translate to him being knight-like in the dark world. Furthermore, since the hammer has Gerson's memories and mannerisms, he would share many of the attributes that made Gerson such a viable candidate. Namely, Gerson was a blacksmith who likely forged armor and weapons, he was a legendary hero in the Undertale timeline, and he was well known as the toughest monster to ever live. All these details together would definitely enhance the hammer's ability to fill the role of the Roaring Knight. Furthermore, as a Darkner infused with the power of a Lightner, the hammer could very well have the ability to create dark fountains. Or, alternatively, it could be that the hammer has stolen the soul of a Lightner in order to grant him this power. We've all been wondering what happened to Des Holiday, right? Well, maybe that's what happened to her. Maybe she was killed, and her soul was absorbed by the knight. Admittedly, she's not a boss monster, but maybe the souls of regular monsters can persist for a little bit longer if they die in a dark world. Other rules change in the dark world after all, so why not that one? In terms of weaponry, Gerson was a flawed candidate because his primary weapon was a hammer instead of a knife. But now that the hammer has become a Darkner, it would make perfect sense for this new entity to wield a different weapon. After all, Azrael never wielded a scarf as a weapon, and yet Rousey does. So why not have the hammer wielding a knife? Or, even if the knight isn't using a knife as its primary weapon, the hammer, having the memories of Gerson, would give him more than enough expertise to forge a knife for him to use when creating dark fountains. But more importantly, as a scholar, Gerson was such a compelling candidate because he was one of the few people who had the expertise necessary to have potentially discovered the existence of dark fountains and the roaring during his studies. As such, thanks to having Gerson's memories, the hammer has inherited all that potential. In terms of motive, like I said before, the hammer could want to bring about the roaring for a variety of reasons. He could do it to understand his purpose, to take revenge on the world, or maybe even to save the world by bringing about the angel's heaven. There's plenty of options. Gerson, and by extension the Hammer, are privy to far more information than we are, so it's likely that they have a better idea of what's at stake and what needs to be done. In terms of opportunity, this is where things get especially effective. Not only have all previous locations used to create dark fountains lined up perfectly with Gerson's experience as a teacher and a scholar, but those exact same memories inform us on where the future fountains will appear. As a special entity that can traverse the dark world and potentially use some sort of underground dark world in order to sneak about, it would be perfectly reasonable for the Hammer to create these dark fountains without being noticed. In fact, considering that Ralsei completely vanishes when you seal dark fountains, it stands to reason that the Hammer may be able to do the same. And if he can teleport or turn invisible or do whatever Ralsei does while in the light world, that would mean he runs zero risk of stumbling into any witnesses. Needless to say, if such an entity like the Hammer truly exists, then he would match all of the known requirements of the Knight while also acting as a fantastic plot twist that nobody would see coming. Everyone will be expecting the Knight to be Kara, or Father Alvin, or Gaster, or Chris, and then they'll be completely astonished to discover someone that looks exactly like Gerson. It would be a truly jaw-dropping reveal, and best of all, it would give the audience the first inkling as to what's truly going on with Ralsei. In short, my personal theory regarding who the Roaring Knight truly is that he is a special Darkner created from the combination of the remains of Gerson Boom and the hammer he was buried with. This entity, wielding the memories of Gerson, would have the powers, the knowledge, and the determination necessary to bring about the Roaring, while also being an entity that the king can respect, that the audience won't expect, and that can provide further hints towards the deeper emotional tragedy surrounding Ralsei. It would also make the Knight a perfect foil for Ralsei, as they would both be special Darkners created from the remains of a monster, but with one of them fighting to bring about the Roaring, while the other fights to stop the Roaring. And this backstory would also fit into the theme of Deltarune perfectly, as the Knight would have had no choice in his creation, no choice in his memories or appearance, and once he realizes the angel is not what he thinks it is, no choice in his ultimate destiny. Your choices aren't the only ones who don't matter. Chris, Ralsei, the Knight, nobody's choices truly matter in this world. They're all just puppets on a grand stage. And with that, I think I've just about covered everything I have to say regarding the Roaring Knight. I hope you guys enjoyed this disgustingly long video. You may have noticed that I didn't bother with any dramatic flair this time around when presenting my personal theory on the hammer. I had some comments in the Ralsei video saying my dramatic presentation of that theory was cringy and obnoxious and overdramatic, which was hard to hear, I must say. I don't exactly have thick skin, but for every person calling me cringy, there was at least a few of you saying you appreciated the dramatic touch. So I hope you guys know I appreciate you. You kind people were the ones I was trying to entertain, so as long as you had fun, I'm satisfied. That said, I'm not quite ready to read 20 comments calling me cringe again, so I tried to tone it down for this theory. I'm still quite excited about it though, and I hope you guys found it interesting. Side note, if my theory is correct, then the knight may have a name that is an anagram of Gerson Boom, just like how Ralsei is an anagram of Asriel. If that's the case, then one option for what his name might be is Oberon Smog, which is a fantastic freaking name for a villain.
Okay, so yeah, that's where that name came from. Oh, God.
Like, holy cow. It also has a ton of thematic significance for the Roaring Knight. Oberon was the king of the fairies in European folklore, and the knight is literally creating fantasy worlds. Plus, his fountains cover the world in black smoke that could easily be referred to as a smog. The Roaring Knight, Oberon Smog. I think it's pretty cool. But yeah, with that, I've finished another Deltarune video. I'm kind of shocked that I've managed to keep at this for so long. I'm thinking my next video will be about the truth of the shadow crystals, although if you guys have any better ideas for video topics, I would love to hear them. You suggested several interesting topics last time, so I'd love to hear more. Also, just allow me to say thank you all again for the incredible support. It really means a lot to me. I've never expected these videos to be as popular as they are. And with that, I think I'll sign off for today. Like if you enjoyed the video, comment if you've got something to say, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, have a fantastic day.
I hope you people appreciate this, because quite honestly, I've been sitting here on and off, like, this video, I've been recording this section plus the section I did before where I had the pause. This is almost 5 hours worth of footage I'm gonna have to pare down, and I am not looking forward to that. Oh god. Again, finally happy to see the source of Oberon Smog. And honestly, again, the thought, again, after all this, the thought that, you know, the knight is somebody we haven't met or is a completely new character or something like that is still very top of my mind. But again, honestly, we'll have to see. Like, more than a couple of weeks ago at this point, but you know, there was that whole meme going around on Twitter. It's like, oh, Deltarune releases tomorrow. But honestly, if Toby keeps to his word that, you know, chapters 3 and 4 are going to be released in 2025, every day that passes, that joke becomes a little more true. So much so that I think I saw somebody had made a calculator that actually, like, calculated the percentage chance that Deltarune's chapter 3 and 4 actually were released tomorrow. Oh god, yeah, but like this is definitely, like, I am going to get changed in my pajamas after this, because I have been recording for so long and I need a break. So yeah, that's definitely going to be it for now. So, of course, as always, original videos linked in the description if you haven't seen it yet for some reason. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day. And yeah, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.